Hey again! So, today on Fundamental Fantasy, we ask a very important question. What even is a game anyway? Like, what defines it as being actually a game? There are a lot of definitions out there, but they typically produce a poor set of results. Sometimes defining things that are obviously games as non-games, or things you don't even play as games. Watching TV is not actually a game. And even if you introduce a drinking game to watch TV, well, even most of those aren't really games either. So, let's take a look at the core components of what makes a game a game. First and foremost, a game absolutely needs to have some way for players to interact with it. And by interact, the stress is really on that first syllable, because that means that both objects need to act upon each other in some way, shape, or form. Games, whether they're tabletop role-playing games, video games, phone games, physical sports games, chess or Monopoly or whatever, must have the player do something which alters what the game does. And this means a drinking game where you have a drink every time someone says "the Force" when watching a Star Wars movie is not really a game, because you didn't really do anything to change the movie. It was a single-sided equation. You reacted to stimuli, but you never interacted with the media itself. If we broadened the definition of a game to include reactions, then that would mean reading a book is a game, because you react to reaching the end of the page by turning the page so you can continue the story. That's not a game. We could argue, however, that choose your own adventure books technically are, in fact, games. For those who have never seen one of these before, you basically have a printed book with an adventure wherein every few pages of story you'll have to make a decision. And which decision you make is chosen by turning to a different page. For example, if you try to attack the giant monster, turn to page 34. If you try to reason with the monster, turn to page 87. In this sense, your interactions with the book, as in making a decision by turning one page or the other, actually alters the nature of the story and the events which unfold. Even though the stories are fairly short and typically meant for children, you can still cram an awful lot of choices into a 200-page paperback, which actually provides some reasonable replay value. This leads us into the second criteria for what makes a game actually a game. It's not good enough to merely have interactions with a game. You have to actually make meaningful changes upon the outcome with intent to do so. If you can't alter what happens, then it doesn't really matter if you made a choice or flipped a switch or whatever. For an example of this, let's take one of those choose-your-own-adventure books we just mentioned. But there's only one true storyline, only one correct path through the book. At every single junction for a choice, you always have two options, and one of those options always ends with "you die" on the very page you turn to. This is essentially a false choice. This happens in video games and, sadly, tabletop RPGs as well pretty often. If you give the player two options, or more, but one or more of them is blatantly wrong, then it's not really a choice. It just looks like one on the surface. For there to be an actual, real choice, there must be pros and cons, some reason to do A, some reason to do B. and the player must be informed, at least in a vague sense, of what the possible outcomes will be. If the player is unable to understand the nature of the choice, because it's deliberately hidden by the designer, game master / mistress. See, this is why I tend to use GM. It covers both and saves me from having to make this stupid qualifier point, or otherwise, just a choice that the player can't possibly know which to make. Then the intent part of the change the outcome in a meaningful way with intent doesn't exist. Okay, if, for example, you were to have a game which has one button and you press the button and it does something different at random every time, then it's not really a game. There must be meaningful change in the potentially random events. But if the player has no capacity to intentionally make a change which leads them towards their goal, then it isn't a game. Even a game of chance has things you can do to swing the balance. In something simple like blackjack, the randomized element is that you can draw a card and get a value of 1 through 11. You know each time you draw a card, you will get a value between those two extreme limits. And depending on the rules of the individual game, maybe only 1 through 10, where if an 11 would put you past the limit, it may count instead as a 1. In this manner, the player roughly knows the odds of asking for another card. If you're at 17, you draw another card, then your next card will be between 1 and 10. And you'll have about a 40% chance, roughly, of getting 18 to 21 without hitting 22 or over. This is a decision where the player knows the risk versus reward scenario, and what the goal they're aiming for is, and what their chances are. The player also knows what their opponent has for cards. They know if their opponent has 16, then therefore their opponent will be forced to take another card because 16 is less than 17. And they know there's a 40% chance for themselves to make it harder for their opponent to win, but a 50% chance for their opponent to tie or better their own score with what both players have at that moment. It's therefore an informed decision to ask for another card or to stick with what they have. In contrast, a slot machine is not a game because, well, what are you doing that makes a meaningful change? Like, you pull the lever, it plays itself. It's not really technically a game, not even a game of chance. The point here is that you have to be able to reasonably know what the options are and what their effects will be to some degree, for the choice to count towards gameplay. Now, this is one of the most important things you will ever learn about game design. So write this down, memorize it, beat it into your skull over and over. Gameplay is derived primarily from choices presented and informed decisions made by players in response to those choices. And those choices must have a meaningful impact upon the outcome. If these things do not apply, then there is virtually never any true gameplay to be had from the action. If there's no gameplay, there's no game. Therefore, when you're adding an element to your game, check to make sure that this is actually providing these effects. Note that a choice can be something as simple as dodge left or dodge right in a video game. If you dodge to the left, you get a potential power-up or other bonus, but a more difficult path, while if you dodge to the right, you get an easier path, but no other benefit. This is a simple risk versus reward scenario which creates gameplay. An alternative option, which provides false difficulty, would be a dodge left or right choice, where the potential pros and cons of each choice are off the screen, and you can't make an informed decision upon such. Note, also, that a player may be limited in the choices they can make based upon their skill, either the character skill or their own personal skill as a player. A character may not have the prerequisite capabilities of making a choice yet when the choice is first presented, either because the player needs to come back later with an appropriate tool, such as in a Metroidvania game, or they missed the secret upgrade they were supposed to get due to not exploring enough previously. As such, these are cases where it's a bit of a gray area whether it counts as gameplay or not, since it depends upon the specific details of exactly what went on. If, for example, a player could notice with a sharp eye that one wall looks different from the others, and there may be something hidden behind it, that's fine. There is an informed decision if the player has the skill to do so. If there's no indication at all, and every wall looks exactly the same, and the player's expected to just walk up to every single wall and press a button to check to see if this is the right wall, that's not really gameplay. It's a stalling tactic to drag out the length of the game and doesn't really provide anything of value. Even worse, it can be a blatantly misleading choice. In Turok, which I've been playing a bit since I got it for Christmas, there's a hidden object which is greatly desired for the player to have. Part of a super weapon they earn by exploring all the levels in the game for hidden pieces of. One of these pieces is hidden behind fake lava, which would normally harm the player greatly to step in. There's no reason for the player to ever explore the area because there's not only no reason for the player to do so, the game actively discourages the player by telling them it's wrong to go there, and they'll be punished if they try, with the mechanics which have already been established at that point in the game. Except the lava doesn't burn you if you step in it, or even swim in it a significant distance as you need to. This is horrible game design because if you do everything right with the information you've been provided up to that point, you can't complete this task. It is literally impossible to do so, unless you make a mistake and find out the rules you've been playing by don't apply because you made a mistake and fell in the lava, or you cheated and looked up the answer online. Adding something like that to a game, regardless of the media the game's built upon, does not add to gameplay. In fact, it subtracts from the total gameplay of the game. One single instance of this isn't enough to make a game no longer count as a game, but it's still poor design. If your entire game revolves around misleading information, false choices, and generally not ever actually providing the players with the appropriate tools to ever be able to make an informed decision, to the point that their actions are arbitrary and it doesn't much matter what they do, they aren't playing a game. Your players have to actually do something to alter the outcome in an intentional way with the information they have been provided. And that leads us to the last part of what really defines a game as a game. Yeah, you probably heard there's other criteria, long lists of things that define a game, but they aren't actually needed. So long as your game has actual interaction with it, the players can make meaningful changes to the outcome. The players can intentionally make those meaningful changes, and a fail state. Strangely enough, you can have a game with a fail state, but no winner possible. For example, were you to have a game where you gain points by performing actions, but there's no real end to the game, such as a pinball machine, then that's fine. You may never win the game, but you can set your score high enough for other players to compare themselves against you. And your winning, in that case, is completely relative to other players. Sports are much the same way. There's not really a win state in most sports, technically speaking. For there to be a win state, you must perform an action that upon completion, the game ends because you have won. If the game ends before this action, then that action didn't cause the winning of the game. Therefore, in a game where there's points, and the team with the most points at the end of a fixed time limit wins the game, then there isn't actually a win state as part of the gameplay directly, because the act of getting the points, scoring the goal or whatever, did not trigger the end of the game. The determination of a winner was applied after the game was completed, much in the same way that there's no win state in the pinball game. The determination of whether you won or not was only made after you ran out of balls to play, and then you looked at your final score and compared it to everyone else on the scoreboard. There is an exception to where sports with scores can have a win state or not. If you have a sport where the game can't end in a tie, and instead goes into a sudden death style setup after the time has elapsed, and both teams or players have the same score, and the next one to make any points at all wins, then you have a clearly defined win state in the game. Now that's all essentially irrelevant, but it should clear up any questions you may have, and works well towards describing the rationale behind a fail state as well. You don't need a win state for it to be a game, but you absolutely must have a fail state. If it's not possible to fail, then invariably you're going to win by playing. There has to be something you can do which leads to failure. Note that you don't necessarily have to have an absolute fail state where you lose the whole game, but there has to be the capacity to fail at an objective or goal within the game at some point. Let's take an example of a video game with a jumping puzzle, but you have infinite lives. With infinite lives, you can keep trying over and over as many times as you want to complete the jumping puzzle. But there still exists a fail state. If you fall to your death into the bottomless pit between the jumps, then you have failed to reach the other side. You must still complete the jumping puzzle to complete the game, and therefore there is a fail state. There are, however, phone apps which call themselves games, but which do not have a true fail state. You may be slowed down, hindered, or told to pay for stuff via microtransactions to continue, but you're never truly able to fail. The reason why this is important is above this point. You still need to have a meaningful impact upon the outcome of the game. If the game's going to wind up the same at the end, no matter what you do, because you can't fail at any point, then it isn't really a game. Note that fail states may be temporary. If you fail your jumping puzzle in the above example, then the fail state means the game doesn't progress. Your actions directly alter in a meaningful way whether the game continues or not. The choices made involve whether you hold the jump button long enough, if you look the correct direction, if you jump again too early or too slow. These choices may be limited by the player's skill, but each one has a clearly defined goal. Criteria which must be met via interaction and intent, and a fail state upon failing to do so. This example is a very basic, limited form of a game, but it does in fact count as a game. There is gameplay to it, and perhaps most importantly, there's a way to define progress. Yeah, I lied to throw you off. There's actually another qualifier of a game beyond the ones mentioned so far. A method to define progress in the game. This is not the same as a win state, but it's part of what makes a game actually a game. This can be as simple as merely keeping score. In our jumping game we just talked about, you can make progress by making more jumps in a row. The player makes 15 jumps. Then the next time she plays, she makes 18, then 19, then 24. This shows improvement by the player, where they've gotten farther than they had before. Something is changing, and she's growing better at the game. There must be a way to define progress, to improve over time, or to work towards a goal. This isn't the same as a win state, as it isn't required that you succeed, only that you better yourself over time. In a game of chance like blackjack, which we mentioned above, this is seen in your win ratio. Sure, each individual game may not be predictable, but an experienced blackjack player will definitely win more often than a bad blackjack player. Meaning there is, in fact, a defining method of progress. Those slot machines, well, there's no progress. You pull the lever and, well, you either win or you don't. There's no control over it. There's nothing you have done which has altered your skill at the game. It is always the same. In contrast, if you look at something like high-stakes poker in particular, you can see how, even though it's a game of chance, the players have a lot of small, informed choices they can make, which defines the final winner. Even though the cards themselves are luck-based, there's an enormous amount of skill which can completely trump the luck-based aspect of the game over time. For a purely 100% luck-based game, where you can roll a die and see the answer and that's your score, there's no progression. You can't ever do anything to impact what happens. And this is why, technically speaking, I didn't actually lie to you. This final qualifier of what defines a game can't really exist if none of the previous qualifiers exist. And if all of the previous qualifiers exist, then this one must also exist as a consequence of such. You can't have meaningful change in a game made with intent and caused by a player's interaction with the game via choices with a fail state present, which doesn't lead to a method to define progress in the game. It's simply impossible by the very nature of the rules which have been applied. Yes, I realize that was a double negative, but that's the thing. It invariably leads to a positive because of such. If you follow all the other criteria for a game, then the last one will exist no matter what you do. There is no way to avoid it. Therefore, does it really count as criteria for a game? Well, yeah, it still does, because it can exist independently of the others. Kind of. It's semantics at this point, really, so whether you want to say it counts or not is kind of up to you. But yeah, it still has to be included within the list. So, final recap. A game, any game, must have the following. A way for players to interact with the game, with the emphasis being that it's a two-way street, where both the game and the player affect each other. A way for players to meaningfully alter the the outcome of the game, as in something changes which alters what happens after that point. If the outcome's the same either way, then it doesn't count. There must also be a way for players to make decisions which lead toward a goal or desired outcome with enough information to do so with clear intent on the player's part. A way for players to invoke a fail state in the game, even if the fail state is only temporary in nature. And finally, even if it's kind of guaranteed by the previous points, there must be a way for players to define their progress somehow. If all of these things are true, then you probably have a game that can be played. If you're somehow missing any of them, then you may have something which resembles a game, but it can't truly provide actual gameplay by its nature. Watching TV is not a game. Reading a book, with the occasional exception of one of those choose your own adventure types, if they follow these rules, is not a game. Even if it may have the word game in its very title, such as a drinking game would, this doesn't magically make it a game. Note that just because something meets all these requirements, it doesn't guarantee that it's a game either. There are certain jobs and such which can meet all these requirements, but that doesn't make it a game. The final qualifying point is something you can't design, so it's not on the list, whether people perform the game for fun or not. You can create mechanics which are fun, but that doesn't mean they'll be used that way. You can also create mechanics which are not fun, but people will still invariably find sadistic pleasure in such. There are people who actually enjoy playing the game Desert Bus. I do use the term game oh so tenuously here because it only technically meets the requirements in the most loose of interpretations, but it does technically meet them. The point is, though, that there are people who can view their job as a game. There are also people who can view a game as a job or a chore. Unfortunately, that's purely subjective in nature, based purely upon the mindset of the individual in question, and therefore can't be used as an objective qualifier for whether something is a game or not. Some people will state MMORPGs aren't games because they feel like a repetitive chore, much like office work. Other people will state that they greatly enjoy playing those exact same MMORPGs. As such, there is no true, final 100% way to define a game. You can only define what is necessary for a game to have, and that if something doesn't have those qualifiers, then you can define that as not being a game. But you can't say with absolute certainty what is a game, because part of what makes a game actually a game is subjective and varies by individual. I suppose you could say it was designed with the intent of being fun. The player can't know the intent of the designer unless it's actually written into the game itself. You could argue a game must have rules, but rules are required to be able to define any of the other criteria present, so it's basically a moot point. You can't even argue that the rules have to be consistent, or at least consistently apply to all individuals or groups playing, because lopsided games exist, such as Evolve, or role-playing games like D&D, which have a GM with different rules than the players. So again, these don't really work as descriptors beyond a semantic perspective. So yeah, a bit of a muddy note to end the video on, but what can you do? Dance party. No, I do not dance. Therefore, we will just end this here and never speak of this again. So, I'm out. I'll see you next time.